What if vampires were real? Tonight's question. The first person the word vampire can be tied to with any historical weight is a man named Vlad, born in 1431 in the Principality of Wallachia. The Principality of Wallachia is now southern Romania. The man's full name was Vlad III of the House of Draculesti. The man's father was inducted into a Christian military order called the Order of the Dragon in 1431. The Order of the Dragon gave the family the nickname Draculesti of the Dragon, and gave the son the nickname Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. The son grew up to be a prince. The son grew up to rule Wallachia 3 times, briefly and violently, between 1456 and 1476. The son's method of execution was the one for which he is remembered. Long wooden stakes driven through the bodies of the condemned, left standing in fields. The fields are the part the chroniclers remembered. The fields are the part the German pamphlet writers of the late 15th century remembered. The fields are the part that gave the son a new name in a German pamphlet printed in 1488. The new name was Vlad the Impaler. The new name is in every history book. The enemies of Vlad III, the Ottoman chroniclers, the Hungarian chroniclers, the Saxon merchants of Transylvania, who had been on the wrong end of his tax policies, were the people who began calling him a blood drinker. The Saxon chronicles of the period describe Vlad III as a man who dipped his bread in the blood of his victims. The Ottoman court records describe Vlad III as a man who drank from a cup of blood before meals. The Russian ambassador to his court in the 1400s wrote back to Moscow describing a prince who was genuinely, in the ambassador's word, demonic. The ambassador's word is in the chronicle. The ambassador's word is not in the historical record. The ambassador's word is the kind of thing enemies write about rulers who are very, very good at killing them. The historical record is the impalements. The historical record is 20,000 stakes in a single campaign in 1457. The historical record is the death tolls, which are real and which are in the European sources of the period. The blood drinking is the part the sources agree on, in the form of rumors. The blood drinking is the part the sources disagree on, in the form of fact. The blood drinking is the part that survived the man's death in 1476 and turned into a folk tradition that would outlive the man by 500 years. The man died in battle. The man died fighting the Ottomans at the place now called Snagov, near Bucharest. The man's body was never recovered with certainty. The man's body was rumored in the period to have been decapitated. The man's head was rumored in the period to have been sent to the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople as proof. The head is in the Ottoman court records, mentioned but not described. The legend is older than the man. The legend predates Vlad III by at least 1,000 years. The legend is what the man was made to fit. The second pillar of the vampire story is a woman named Elizabeth, born in 1560 in the Kingdom of Hungary. The woman's full name was Elizabeth Bathory. The woman was a countess. The woman's family owned more land in the Kingdom of Hungary than almost any other family. The woman was married at the age of 15 to Count Ferenc Nadasdy. The couple lived in Chachtice Castle, a stone fortress in the mountains of what is now western Slovakia. Count Nadasdy was away at war against the Ottomans for most of the marriage. Count Nadasdy died in 1604. The Countess was, by the time of her husband's death, the most powerful landowner in the region. The Countess was, by the time of her husband's death, already the subject of rumors that would not go away. The rumors claimed that the Countess was killing young women in her household. The rumors claimed that the Countess was bathing in the blood of the young women. The rumors claimed that the Countess was doing this in the belief that the blood preserved her youth. The rumors were investigated, formally, between 1610 and 1611 by the Hungarian king. The king appointed a special commission. The commission interviewed more than 300 witnesses. The commission produced a list of more than 80 alleged victims. The victims were young women. The victims were from the local villages. The victims were, for the most part, peasant girls in service to the castle. The trial testimony is in the Hungarian archives. The trial testimony is in the Vienna archives, which inherited the Hungarian records after the Habsburg takeover. The trial testimony is in the form of depositions from servants, from local villagers, from a midwife, from a former castle steward. The trial testimony describes the killings. The trial testimony describes the disposal of the bodies, which were reportedly buried in the cellars of the castle. The trial testimony is consistent across the depositions in a way that historians of the period have found unusual. The Countess was never put on public trial. The Countess was confined for the remaining 4 years of her life in a single set of rooms in Chachtice Castle. The Countess died in 1614 in those rooms. The Countess was buried in haste in the churchyard at Chachtice. The grave is unmarked. The brick walls, the legend describes the brick walls of a hidden bathroom. The blood-stained stones, the cries of the victims, are not in the trial testimony. The brick walls were added, in the legend, in the 18th and 19th centuries. The brick walls were the part the legend needed. The trial testimony is the part the legend is built on top of. The trial testimony is real and disturbing, and the historical basis for what became one of the most famous stories in European folklore. The Countess was, by every measure, a violent person. The Countess was, by every measure, capable of the killings she was accused of. The Countess was, by every measure, a real figure in Hungarian history. The bloodbathing is the part the legend added. The bloodbathing is the part the legend kept, because the legend needed a way to connect the historical violence to the older folk belief in the blood-drinking dead. Mercy Brown was born in 1872 in Exeter, Rhode Island. The family was a farming family. The family lived in a small house on a small piece of land. The family had 3 children. The family had, by the winter of 1891, a problem. The problem was tuberculosis. The problem was the leading cause of death in New England in the 1890s. The problem was what people in the 1890s called consumption. The problem was what the family of Mercy Brown called the disease that was taking our children. The disease took Mercy Brown's older sister Mary Olive in 1888. The disease took Mercy Brown's mother Mary in 1890. The disease took Mercy Brown's brother Edwin in the fall of 1891. The disease, in the language of the period, was a disease of the lungs. The disease was understood in the period to be contagious. The disease was understood in the period to be hereditary. The disease was not understood in the period in the way we now understand it. The disease was understood by the family and the community to be something that one person could give to another. The disease was understood by the family and the community to be something that a dead person could, somehow, give to a living one. The community of Exeter, Rhode Island, in the 1890s, was a community that still believed in the folk concept of the vampire. The community of Exeter, Rhode Island, was a community of New England farmers of Puritan descent who had brought the vampire belief with them from the old country and had never quite let it go. The belief, in the language of the period, was that a person who died of consumption could come back. The belief was that the dead could drain the life from the living. The belief was that the way to save the living was to find the dead. The belief was that the way to find the dead was to open the graves. The belief, in the language of the period, was that the recently dead, the freshest corpses, the ones most recently interred, were the most likely culprits. The belief, in the language of the period, was that the body would be found with fresh blood in the heart and the liver. The belief, in the language of the period, was that the only way to stop the disease was to burn the organs, mix them with water, and force the living to drink. The belief was, in the language of the period, a matter of life and death. The belief, in the language of the period, was the only thing the family of Mercy Brown had left to try. The father, George Brown, in the winter of 1892, was desperate. The father, George Brown, in January of 1892, asked the local doctor to dig up the bodies. The doctor, in the language of the period, was a believer. The doctor, in the language of the period, agreed. The doctor, in January of 1892, dug up 4 bodies from the Brown family plot. The doctor, in January of 1892, opened the bodies one by one. The first body, the mother's, was decomposed. The first body had no fresh blood. The first body was ruled out. The second body, the older sister's, was decomposed. The second body had no fresh blood. The second body was ruled out. The third body, Edwin's, was decomposed. The third body had no fresh blood. The third body was ruled out. The fourth body was Mercy Brown. The fourth body, the most recently interred, was found with the organs still intact. The fourth body's heart and liver were found, in the language of the period, to contain fresh blood. The fourth body was declared, in the language of the period, to be the vampire. The fourth body's heart and liver were removed. The fourth body's heart and liver were burned on a rock behind the Brown family house. The fourth body's ashes were mixed with water. The fourth body's ashes were given to their surviving family member, a son, to drink. The son drank. The son, in the language of the period, did not survive. The son died of tuberculosis in 1892, the same year. The belief, in the language of the period, did not save him. The belief, in the language of the period, was wrong. The belief, in the language of the period, was the best his father could do. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is the strigoi. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is the upir. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is the Nosferatu. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is a figure that appears, in one form or another, in the folklore of every Slavic-speaking people, from the Balkans to the Urals. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is older than Christianity in the region. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is older than the Slavic languages. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is, in some scholars' view, a pre-Indo-European figure, a remnant of a much older religion that was absorbed into Slavic folklore, the way the Greek pantheon was absorbed into the Roman. The strigoi, in Romanian folklore, is the soul of a dead person who has returned. The strigoi can rise from the grave. The strigoi can take many forms: a dog, a moth, a ball of light. The strigoi feeds on the blood of the living. The strigoi can be killed by driving a stake through the heart, by burning the body, by garlic placed in the coffin, by the rite of the Orthodox Church. The upir, in Russian and Ukrainian folklore, is similar. The upir is more violent. The upir attacks family members. The upir attacks the people it knew in life. The upir rises from the corpse. The upir is stopped, in the Slavic tradition, by the same methods: stake, fire, garlic, ritual. The Nosferatu, the term that would later be used for the vampire in the West, is a Romanian word, attested in the 1800s, meaning the Nosferatu, or the plague spreader, or, by one disputed etymology, the unborn. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is not the only root. The Slavic root of the modern vampire is parallel to figures in other cultures: the jiangshi of Chinese folklore, the hopping reanimated corpse of the Qing dynasty, the penanggalan of Malay folklore, the detached head that flies at night and feeds on the blood of pregnant women, the kalupalik of Inuit folklore, the wendigo of Algonquian folklore, the aswang of the Philippines, the tikbalang of the Philippines, the capri of the Philippines, the vitala of Indian folklore, the rakshasa of Hindu mythology, the lilitu of Mesopotamian mythology, the lamia of Greek mythology, the empusa of Greek mythology. The figure of the blood-drinking undead is, in some form, in every human culture. The figure of the blood-drinking undead predates recorded history. The figure of the blood-drinking undead is older than agriculture. The figure of the blood-drinking undead is, in some scholars' view, a universal human response to the experience of death. The figure of the blood-drinking undead is the dead who do not stay dead. The figure of the blood-drinking undead is the body that moves. The figure of the blood-drinking undead is the body that, in the language of the period, is not finished. The Slavic tradition is the version that survived in the West. The Slavic tradition is the version that was carried into the 18th and 19th century European vampire panic. The Slavic tradition is the version that Bram Stoker would draw on in 1897. The Slavic tradition is the version that would, in a single generation, become the global archetype. The Slavic tradition is older than the man. The Slavic tradition predates Vlad III by at least 1,000 years. The Slavic tradition is what the man was made to fit. The modern literary vampire was not born in a castle. The modern literary vampire was born at a summer house on the shore of Lake Geneva in 1816 at a gathering organized by Lord Byron. The gathering included Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Godwin, later Mary Shelley, John Polidori, and Claire Clairmont. The gathering was, in the language of the period, a way to pass the time during a wet Swiss summer. The gathering was, in the language of the period, a way to read German ghost stories aloud. The gathering was, in the language of the period, a competition to see who could write the best horror story. The gathering produced, in the language of the period, two of the foundational works of the modern horror genre. The gathering produced, in the language of the period, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and John Polidori's The Vampire. The Vampire was published in 1819. The Vampire was the first vampire novella in English. The Vampire was, in the language of the period, attributed to Byron at first, because Polidori was too junior to be the author of a fashionable horror story, and because the story was based on a fragment Byron had sketched. The Vampire introduced the character of Lord Ruthven, a dissipated English nobleman who preys on the innocent. The Vampire introduced the tropes that would, in the next 78 years, become the standard vampire, the aristocratic predator, the innocent victim, the seduction as feeding, the death as metaphor for sexual transgression. The Vampire was a hit in Europe. The Vampire was adapted for the stage in Paris, in London, in every major city. The Vampire made the aristocratic vampire, in the language of the period, a marketable figure. The Vampire was the seed. The seed was, in the language of the period, what the next 78 years would grow. The next major work in the lineage was, in the language of the period, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, published in 1872, which introduced the female vampire and the lesbian subtext. The next major work in the lineage was, in the language of the period, Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897, which consolidated the modern vampire and made the figure permanent. The Dracula was not, in the language of the period, the first vampire novel. The Dracula was, in the language of the period, the synthesis. The Dracula was, in the language of the period, what the modern vampire became. The Dracula was, in the language of the period, the book that turned the folk figure into a global archetype. The Dracula was, in the language of the period, the book that would be adapted into the 1922 film Nosferatu, the 1931 Bela Lugosi Dracula, the 1958 Hammer Horror of Dracula, the 1979 Werner Herzog Nosferatu, The Vampire, the 1992 Francis Ford Coppola Bram Stoker's Dracula, the 2012 TV series Dracula, and the countless other works that have, in the language of the period, kept the figure alive. The Dracula was, in the language of the period, the book that made the blood-drinking undead a permanent resident of Western popular culture. The blood-drinking undead is the figure, in the language of the period, that came from the Lake Geneva gathering in 1816 and never left. There is a disease called porphyria. The disease is real.